Good afternoon. My name is Tom Simchak. I'm ESA's Director of Research and Programs. Thank you for attending today's webinar titled Resilience, a Locational Approach. The webinar is being recorded and will be available later on at energystorage.org. Throughout the webinar, you can submit questions through the chat box in your browser. And following the webinar, you will receive a brief survey regarding today's topic and topics for future webinars. Your feedback ensures that ESA continues to provide the highest value information for you and your organization. We really do value your feedback. We really do read what you write, so please let us know. All meetings and teleconferences of the Energy Storage Association are held in accordance with our antitrust guidelines. We ask that you abide by these guidelines during today's webinar. The full guidelines are available in the members area of the ESA website. If you're not yet an ESA member and would like more information, you can reach out to my colleague Richie O'Neill. Membership includes free access to our full range of webinars, among numerous other benefits, so please reach out for more information. Before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief update on upcoming ESA events. The ESA Annual Conference will be held in Phoenix, Arizona from April 16th to 18th. It's ESA's premier event. We bring together the energy storage community, the themes of expansion, inclusion, and integration in the energy storage sector. Registration is still open. There's still some room in the hotel block, so certainly we hope you can register for that. Folks on this webinar might particularly find interesting our keynote session, which will include ESA's CEO, Kelly Speaks-Bachman, moderating a discussion between the CEOs and presidents of the Solar Energy Industries Association, the California Electric Transportation Coalition, American Wind Energy Association, and the Edison Electric Institute. They'll be talking about how storage can partner with the technologies and initiatives advanced by their associations to result in a better world through a more resilient, efficient, sustainable, and affordable electricity grid. So really about where energy storage can fit within the whole energy sector space and the benefits of storage. Should be really great. Really looking forward to it. Got a whole lot of exciting sessions. Have a look at the agenda. You got the web address there on your screen. It's going to be a great event, and I can highly recommend it. We also have a golf tournament. The space is still open if you're keen to come out, play around at golf with other folks in the storage industry. We also have a packed webinar schedule for the remainder of the year. You can find at energystorage.org. If you go down to events there on the main page. Next week, as part of our Storage 101 series, we'll be addressing economics and financing for energy storage. On the 30th, we have a members-only town hall webinar, which will have a state legislative roundup. So you've been reading about recent progress and goings-on in New York and Maryland, for example, but elsewhere around the country too. And if you're particularly interested in resilience, this won't be the only webinar this year around resilience. This summer, we're going to do one on how storage is being used by the Department of Defense to ensure the resilience of bases and other security aspects. And we are looking at a number of other themes for webinars this year that will touch on resilience. So keep an eye on the ESA website as we add those to the calendar. Today we'll be discussing resilience in our electric system operations and how energy storage can contribute to a more resilient power system. Our speaker is Jeremy Twitchell from the Pacific Northwest National Lab. And he'll be discussing what resilience is, how we can measure it, how to think about it in terms of locational considerations. Advances in energy storage have created new paths to a more resilient power system, both on the grid and for individual end users. So very excited to have Jeremy back to speak on another ESA webinar. After Jeremy's remarks, we'll open up to Q&A. You can type questions in the chat box at any time, and I'll be reading those out when we get to the Q&A session at the end. So thank you for attending today's webinar, and now I will hand control over to Jeremy. Go ahead.
All right. Can you hear me okay?
We can, thanks.
All right. I apologize for the picture on the previous slide. That was taken my first day at the lab with my goofy. I'm just happy to be here, Grin, and I will make sure I have a new headshot for the next one of these. So as Tom said, my name is Jeremy Twitchell. I'm an energy research analyst at the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. My main job here is to work on the Department of Energy's energy storage program, working in the equitable regulatory environment area. So dealing a lot with the barriers that exist in energy storage and current regulations and planning approaches that we use, and trying to figure out, better ways to do things, better ways to navigate those barriers, identifying best practices that are emerging around the country. And my colleague Rebecca O'Neill, who helped put this all together, unfortunately couldn't be with us today. She has other obligations. And for those of you who know Rebecca, I apologize profusely. She's an excellent speaker, but today you're just stuck with me. So what I'm presenting today comes out of a workshop that we did for the Hawaii Public Utilities Commission back in December. We were there for a day-long workshop on energy storage, and they asked us to put together a workshop, a session on how they could use energy storage to meet some of their goals around resilience for the islands. And so what we did is we just put together a little bit of preliminary research, kind of help understand, okay, what are the challenges out there? How can we tee up a good discussion? And so in that workshop, we had representatives from the commission, from utilities, from project developers. We had a really good mix of people. We had a really good discussion. And we walked out of there thinking, okay, this is a lot bigger than just what we heard here today in Hawaii. So what we've been trying to do is kind of do a little more research, build out some of the ideas that we heard and some of the initial ideas we had, and come up with a framework for how we can conceptualize resilience and how we can start really planning to improve electric grid resilience. So what I'm sharing here today is it's still somewhat preliminary. We have a report that will be coming out within the next month or so, but I'm not presenting a lot of answers today. We're raising some questions. We're proposing some ideas for potentially addressing some of those questions. But really what I'm hoping for is a discussion. I'm very interested in hearing from industry experts about, are we on the right track? So I hope we have a good discussion at the end of this. So before I begin, I just want to point out that, all of the work that I'm presenting here today was funded by the Department of Energy through the Energy Storage Program within the Office of Electricity under the direction of Dr. Juk. And, as always, we're grateful for the DOE and Dr. Juk and their continuing support of us. So the goal for this presentation today is just propose a conceptual definition of resilience as a local value, and then a planning framework for how we can think about making investments to improve resilience on the grid. So we'll talk a little bit about reliability and resilience, how they differ, but how we can start to think about resilience in terms of the reliability standards that we already have. We'll talk about the economics of resilience and how they're pretty challenging, but how energy storage has really opened up a lot of avenues that weren't there before. And then finally, we'll move into that planning framework. This kind of 3 steps to look at how we can improve resilience. Identifying the risks to resilience, identifying the critical loads that we need to support in a major event, and then engaging in bi-level planning, and I'll get into that later on. So reliability and resilience. The problem statement here is that reliability is an objective concept. We have lots of mandatory enforcement standards from NERC. We have lots of voluntary standards from NERC. We have reporting metrics from the IEEE. A lot of metrics, a lot of standards that give us tangible planning objectives and make reliability a monetizable service. Resilience, on the other hand, is more subjective. We don't have specific metrics and standards. We don't really even have an agreed upon definition. So when you're talking about planning for resilience, it's really hard to develop the kind of tangible planning objectives that a planning model needs, or to develop any kind of revenue, how to monetize that resilience service. So just so we have kind of a conceptual understanding of what we're meaning when we talk about resilience, DOE's Quadrennial Energy Review in 2017 defined resilience as the ability of a system or its components to adapt to changing conditions and withstand and rapidly recover from disruptions. So conceptually, one way to think about this is reliability is an inward-focused concept. We're looking at how does the grid function when it's on its own, day-to-day operations, normal wear and tear, normal interruptions, branches, squirrels, things of that nature. But resilience is an outward-focused concept. With resilience, we're talking about how does the grid respond when something external, something significant impacts the grid. A major storm, earthquake, tsunami, what have you. These major external events that cause significant outages. And just one important note to keep in mind is that, reliability standards, these are firm requirements that a utility must meet, subject to least cost requirements. But absent similar standards, resilience is basically just a goal that we pursue if and when it's cost effective. So when we talk about reliability standards, just a snapshot of what NERC says. So NERC has, as I pointed out, more than 100 different standards for reliability. But from a planning perspective, NERC says, okay, when you're planning your bulk power system, your transmission and generation system, you need to look at what happens when things go out. So they call it N-1, normal operations minus one asset, a transmission line or a generator. N-1, what happens if something goes out and it causes something else to go out. And then N-2, what happens if two things go out. And the point of all these exercises is for the utility to develop what's called a remedial action scheme. What the utility is going to do in each one of these scenarios. And sometimes it can be as simple as just, new switching orders, some load shedding, some protective relays, things that don't require significant infrastructure. But other times they do reveal a need for additional transmission infrastructure, additional generation. So my important note there kind of echoes the one on the previous page, but one important addition is that when we're talking about making resilience investments subject to cost effectiveness, there's no general agreed upon screening tool for determining the cost effectiveness of resilience investments. We don't have any kind of infrastructure or process or practice in that area. So because of all these robust reliability requirements that we have a lot of significant reserve generation capacity. What you see here is from NERC. This is their 2018 long-term reliability assessment, where they're looking out a couple of years, and they're looking at all the various regions under NERC jurisdiction in North America. And so on this graph, you'll see a black line for each region. That's where NERC's analysis said the region should be in terms of their reserve generation capacity. And then for each region, you also see a dark blue line, the anticipated reserve margin. This is essentially what is most likely going to be on the grid in 2020. And then you'll see the prospective reserve margin, which is essentially if everything that's in the queue to come on by that time actually came online. So the takeaway here is that we have a lot of reserve generation capacity in this country. Most regions are well above what NERC's recommended level would be. And so because of that significant reserve generation capacity, we have a highly resilient generation system. So that pie chart you'll see on the left, that's from an analysis that the Rhodium Group did a couple years ago, where they looked at all reported electric outages in the U.S. from 2012 to 2016. And they found that more than 96% of those outages were driven by weather events. 31% of those, almost 32% of those alone were Hurricane Sandy. A key takeaway here is that, generation-specific problems were very, very, very rare. And just diving a little further into that on the right, NERC's analysis of Hurricane Sandy concluded that, in some cases, customers were without power for up to 2 weeks. But despite that, there was sufficient generation to meet demand at all times. And going back to the previous slide, we can see that, you look at PJM, you look at New York, you look at New England where Hurricane Sandy hit, and these are all regions that have a lot of reserve generation capability. And so despite, the widespread plan outages that took place, there was enough generation between, what was in those regions and what they could call upon from neighboring regions. But those extensive outages that we saw, lasting up to 2 weeks in some cases, were because of damage to distribution and transmission systems, and they were exacerbated by, continuously bad weather that delayed restoration efforts. So the upshot here, when we're talking about major events, when we're talking about long-term outages, we're usually talking about the delivery of energy and not necessarily the generation of it. So moving on to reliability metrics. So IEEE has standard 1366-2012, which essentially sets the standards for how utilities should report their reliability. And so IEEE identified 13 metrics, and of those, 4 of them are commonly used by utilities in reliability reporting. So you've got SAIFI, which is asking, how often does the average customer experience an outage? You've got SAIDI, which is asking how long is the average customer without power through the course of a year. You've got CAIDI that looks at just the subset of customers who did experience an outage. among that subset, how long were they without power? And then finally, you've got average service availability index, or ASI, which is basically saying, like, for the average customer throughout the year, what percentage of the time was the grid up? We have a very reliable grid in North America. These ASI scores are usually 99.9%. But what's interesting about IEEE 1366 is that there's also two circumstances that are explicitly removed from reliability reporting. So one of those is a major event day, and this is any day in which the SAIDI score, or the number of outages that the average customer has faced in a day, is more than 2.5 times higher than the daily average over the previous 5 years. So in other words, something bad happened, something well outside the norm happened. And then a catastrophic day, which IEEE did not define, but recommended that utilities and regulators define on an as-needed basis. So we do this for very good reason. We emit these major and catastrophic events because if we included them, it would drive up baseline scores, and it would, it basically mask a lot of legitimate reliability problems that do exist on the grid. But the challenge is that by excluding these major events, we're also excluding, in many cases, a significant number of outages that customers actually faced from the reporting process. So just as an illustration of what this looks like, this is for some of the preparation work we did for the workshop in Hawaii. We looked at the reliability reports for the, Hawaiian Electric and their 3 subsidiary companies from 2008 to 2017. And so what you'll see on the left there is their non-normalized annual score. So what that's saying is that, including major events, this is how often the average customer was without power in our system. Then on the right, you'll see the normalized score, which is taking out those major events. And just to compare, on the left, you'll see that each one of those utilities had at least 1 year in which their SAIDI score peaked above 800 minutes, which meant that the average customer in that system was without power for more than 13 hours per year. That's the average customer. Remember that some customers didn't experience an outage at all. Other customers experienced outages that lasted much longer than 13 hours, or summed up to much more than 13 hours. But once we remove those major events on the right, you can see that we only have one utility that even gets above 200, and other than that, there's a pretty tight cluster between 100 and 150 minutes. So basically what we're saying here is that if you look at the average scores for these 3 utilities, their average non-normalized score, their average normalized score, and you can see that we're removing between 40 and 56% of the total outages that customers faced from the reliability process or reporting process, because we said these are major events that don't really have to do with the reliability. So what we're suggesting in this work we're doing is that if we want to increase resilience, this is where we start. We start with these major events that are already documented. We understand what's driving them, how long they've lasted, what their impacts have been, and we can understand what we need to do about them. So once we've decided to improve resilience, the economics are difficult. Resilience, if you're approaching it as a standalone application, it's expensive and rarely needed. Again, looking at these scores that we looked at, we're removing 60 minutes per year, 80 minutes per year. We're only talking about an hour, maybe a few hours a year where this resilient asset is going to be called upon in most cases. But if you think about it, because of reliability standards, we have a lot of assets on the grid right now that are only used a few hours a year. But absent some kind of similar standards that values resilience in the same way we value reliability, these resilient projects that we want to do, they have to pencil out from a cost-benefit standpoint. So that leads us to conclude that, well, these resilience investments, they must provide other value-added services to the grid. They have to do something to buy down their own cost. They need offsetting benefits if they're going to have any hope of passing that cost-effectiveness test that they'll need to pass. And so what this suggests is that microgrids, miniaturized portfolios that can provide multiple grid services are really going to carry the day here. They're really going to be able to provide that suite of services to the grid that's going to defray their costs and give them a chance of proving cost-effective. And once you've made this investment, once you've acquired these assets, built these projects, then you get into some complicated questions of cost allocation. Who benefits from this added resilience? Is it a system property, the same way that we consider reliability to be a system property, or does it only benefit a handful of local customers? The answers are probably going to vary from one project to the next. A resilient investment at an emergency center probably isn't the same as a resilient investment in a manufacturing plant from a cost allocation perspective. And so what we need to start thinking about, how do we develop principles for attributing these benefits? How do we quantify the benefits of resilience, and how do we attribute them so that we can also figure out how to attribute the costs of those investments? So, energy storage really has changed the way we think about resilience. This graph was done by my colleague here at the lab, Patrick Balducci, and his team. It's essentially a very, very large literature study, literature review, where they looked at multiple studies of energy storage that have been done around the country and looked at the value of all these different services it can provide in all these different places and what the range of those values are from these analyses that have been done. I don't want to dive too much into the weeds on this graph, but a couple key points to keep in mind is that because we have all these reliability standards, we have a wide range of monetizable grid services. And because of its flexible nature and its scalable nature, energy storage can meet a broad range of those services, and it can also be scaled to be located in a place where those services are most valuable. So, and just to point out, how energy storage really has kind of changed the game when it comes to resilience is, there on the left is what traditional resilience looks like. I need to have a resilient power supply, so I build a generator, and that generator provides capacity and energy. Well, from a grid perspective, my grid operator, my utility, has probably much more cost-effective sources of capacity and energy than my backup generator. Now, there are exceptions to this. There have been models around the country. There's one at my home utility here in Portland. APS has done this in Arizona, where utilities are monetizing these backup generators. And so it can be done, but it's not generally a widespread practice. And so, me as the project owner, I have this high-cost generation resource to provide backup power, and I don't have a lot of opportunities to participate in the grid and generate revenue. So what we end up with is what I call mission-critical resistance. It's limited to facilities that have to have resilience: hospitals, sensitive manufacturing facilities, places of that nature. But now with energy storage, we're moving more into this economic resilience model, where it's not just based on who has to have resilience. We still have a generator at the core of this that's providing capacity and energy, but now we can add things like solar that can also provide capacity and energy, but can also generate fuel savings, potentially generate revenue from net metering. And we have a storage device that can generate revenue by providing a wide range of grid services: regulation, reserves, arbitrage, what have you. And when we take this portfolio approach, we increase our opportunities for grid participation. We have these offsetting revenues that reduce system costs. And so essentially what we're doing is we're making resilience viable for a broader range of facilities. And we're starting to see this around the country. We're seeing resilience-focused programs that are resulting in infrastructure at military bases. They're resulting in infrastructure at the individual residential home at that level. So we are starting to see this model take off. So how do we figure out what to build and where? So a lot of the discussion about resilience lately, especially at the national level, has taken this system-level view. We've had things like it's about fuel security, it's about transmission planning. What we're suggesting here is that we think about resilience as a local value. And so we've got these three steps that we're proposing. The first is to identify risks. This is just look at the past. What is driving major outages at the site in question? What can we learn from utility reliability reports? Second step, define critical loads. What are the loads that I need to maintain through these risks that I've identified? And what is my tolerance for not maintaining those loads? And I'll explain a little bit more what that means. And then the third step is to engage in bi-level planning. And so here we're talking about
not just planning at my project level for what I need to provide resilience for the site in question or for the feeder in question, but what do I need to make sure that, what do we need from a grid investment perspective to make sure that communications and control infrastructure are going to enable these services that are needed to make this resilient asset cost effective. So that first point, identify risks. We're just looking at what are the major events that we already know about, high winds, whatever they may be. What are the potential major events that we're worried about? Earthquakes, tsunamis. We've already seen how New York is fundamentally redesigning how it thinks about resilience through the REV proceeding, which came out of Hurricane Sandy. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we sit on a major fault line that's a question of when, not if, it will rupture. And so there's been a lot of discussion here in the last few years about how do we identify, where the damage will take place, and how do we build an infrastructure that will allow for emergency services at a minimum to be up and running when this happens. The key takeaway here, the key thing to keep in mind is that resilience risks they're site specific. When we dove into the reliability reports for the Hawaiian utilities, the thing that really surprised me, I went in assuming that, these utilities are all, they're closely located geographically, they have the same climate, they're probably going to be facing the same risks. But what we found is that each island had very specific risks that it was facing. On one island, their major source of major outages was under frequency load shedding, where they just had to shed load to keep the grid in balance. Another island, they had major problems with high winds, downing power lines, and then also problems with equipment failures. And then when we got to Oahu, their main outage, they had one big outage in 2008, which was this massive storm with lightning and wind that downed the entire island for a little over 12, 13 hours, I think it was. So, these risks that you're thinking about, they are very site specific. They're going to differ from one utility to the next. They may even differ from one feeder to the next. And you have to be cognizant of what those specific risks are to the site in question, to the feeder in question. So the second step, define critical loads. What are the functions that must be maintained? What are the loads that must be maintained, and for how long do they need to be maintained? What are we designing against? As an example, I have colleagues here at the lab who have been doing this kind of work for military bases, and the general planning standard that they've been given is, the base needs to be able to be operate in fully islanded mode for 2 weeks with a 90% confidence level of meeting load. And by confidence level, we're meaning like how likely is this set of resources going to meet my needs over the period I've identified. And the idea here is you can design a system that will give you 100% certainty of meeting the needs that you've identified. But if you're willing to accept a 90% chance of meeting the needs, the costs come down significantly. So, what are the acceptable trade-offs here? The key takeaway for this step is just, define success first. Our planning models, these are computer models. They need a tangible outcome to meet. They need to understand what is the load that needs to be met, how long does it need to be met, and what are the resource characteristics. How do I build a portfolio that will meet those needs? And then this final step, engage in bi-level planning. So, first is looking at the local grid conditions. Is there a specific grid service that is most valuable for my site in question? And can I design my resilience asset in a way that will provide that service and generate revenue for the project operator? And also looking at communications and control infrastructure. Is it there? Can the grid handle this kind of asset? If not, what kind of additional infrastructure will be needed? And then looking at the project level, just looking at, again, it's a portfolio-based approach. I think a lot of discussion in the energy industry lately has kind of been steering in this direction where we're trying to find silver bullets, we're trying to find resources that can do it all. And we've forgotten that it's always been about a portfolio, it's always been about a suite of assets that can do different things. And it's just that we're dealing with different portfolios now. We're dealing with different types of resources, but it's still always going to be about a portfolio. So what is the mix of resources that will meet the specific project needs? And looking at what are the sources of revenue. Are there demand charges we can avoid? Is there net metering revenue that we can earn? Just making sure that all those drivers are accounted for in the planning. And the takeaway here is that optimal configuration will vary by location. So just in summary, our thought here is that pursuing increased resilience through grid-level policies is unlikely to be successful. And that's for two reasons. First is that, most of the interruptions that we've seen, especially these major outages, these long-term interruptions, they're coming from the delivery of energy, not the generation. And also, just by defining, if we try to increase resilience at the system level, that's a really big problem to try and solve all at once. By breaking it down into local, like critical loads, and looking for local on-site solutions, we're making it into a much more manageable problem, a much more manageable challenge. Second point, energy storage significantly improves the economics of resilience. So I can't stress this enough. Resilience as a standalone investment is costly. Ideally, you'll never have to use it. Hopefully, we'll never have to use that resilient asset. So what can we do from a no regrets standpoint to design it in a way that even if it's rarely used, even if it's never used, it was still a good investment? And energy storage paired with other resources can generate that kind of revenue, can offer those kind of grid services that really reduces that net cost. But to do this all, you need deliberate planning. You need to be able to look at the grid level, understand what the grid needs are, what the grid capabilities are, and you need to really have a robust planning approach at the project level to make sure you're considering multiple possible futures, multiple possible scenarios, and understanding what all the revenue drivers are. So this forthcoming report, these are the recommendations that we're making for next steps for future research. The first one there, we're recommending that DOE and the national labs, we start to think about resilience as a local value. Again, make it more manageable, use the data that we already have from utility reliability reports. Second point is that we need granular planning tools. We need planning tools that can look at a microgrid portfolio. Look at, okay, in this scenario, in this situation, what is the best mix of assets? Through all the research and the initiatives that we've done over the years, DOE and the labs have a lot of modeling tools that do a lot of different things, and in some cases they overlap. And so we're suggesting that we revisit some of those tools and leverage the capabilities they have and make them more accessible to a broad range of audiences of end users who are interested in this topic of resilience. And then finally, we need to do some additional research to inform planning and tariff design. How do we identify grid values at a very granular basis? How do we identify the value of services on this feeder versus that feeder at this site versus that site? And how do we conceptualize the value of resilience in a way that will allow us to allocate those benefits and allocate those costs? Regulators have long-standing practices about how to allocate costs of traditional resource investments because we understand what the benefits are and how the benefits flow. And we don't have that for resilience. So to get to a place where we can really, normalize these investments and allocate those costs and treat them really like we treat any other utility investment, how do we inform that conversation? How do we inform tariff design in a way that will incent end-use customers and private developers to just engage in this behavior on their own? So, as I said at the beginning, I'm hoping that we have a great conversation. But my questions to you is, does this ring true? Are we on the right track? Are we missing anything? I would welcome any conversation that we can have and any insight that this audience may have. And with that, I'm happy to take questions.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. Folks can submit questions, comments, feedback via the chat box, and I can read those out for Jeremy. One quick question to start off with. You mentioned the forthcoming DOE report. Where will people be able to find that report, and is there a sense of timeline?
Yeah, so if the report that we're working on, that will be on PNNL's website. I'd be happy to
to share it with ESA, and they can let people know when it comes out. But really, within the next month or so, we're working on the final draft, just working on a few edits and comments that we got back, but it's near future.
Great, thanks. Next question comes from Richard Van, who asks, could you discuss some general system requirements for an energy storage system, and how precise will you need to be in planning for these events?
That's a really good question, and like all really good questions, the answer is it depends. And this is where you really need to get in to understand what the local values are. What are the grid services that are of most value in the area? What are the site requirements that you need, that you need to meet? And the answer is going to vary. I wish I could give you a more direct answer, but it's really going to vary. It's going to depend on what the values are. It's going to depend on what the needs are. Just kind of as an anecdotal example, we've looked at two resilient agreements. One in Arizona between Arizona Public Service and the Marine Corps Air Station at Yuma, and we've looked at another one at the Pacific Missile Test Range on Kauai in Hawaii, between them and their local utility cooperative there. And it's two projects that had very different outcomes. In Arizona, the military base is located behind a grid constraint, and so all they needed was generation. All the utility needed there was generation. So they put in 25 megawatts. I don't remember the exact amount of diesel generator, and that's all they have. They just have the diesel generators, but to meet the grid needs that existed there, that was the best solution. And that also provides backup power for the military base when the grid goes down. But then if you look at the Hawaii case, that the utility there had significant needs for grid services, for ancillary services. They needed a device that could provide spinning reserve, could provide frequency response. And so the outcome there was a solar plus storage. And I think there might also be some diesel generation on that one as well. And so it's really going to depend. The inclusion of storage, the size of the storage is going to depend on what the grid needs are at the site in question, and they're going to depend on what the project needs are.
Thanks. He asked a follow-up question then, saying, I'm thinking about if we were an energy storage OEM and or integrator, so when and how it would be best to engage, when and how would it be best for an OEM or integrator to engage with you on this topic? So if one of those companies were interested in getting more involved, how could they go about that?
So a couple things. I would say, watch utility requests for proposals very closely, and look for ways where your technology, your resources might fit with an identified need. I would suggest, I don't know what your capabilities are, but if you're capable of getting involved in the integrated resource planning process and really understanding how utilities are identifying needs and maybe where they might need a little bit of help of understanding what your technology can do, that might be a way. But those would be a couple thoughts that I have.
Great, thanks. I'll remind participants can submit questions, comments, or any other feedback via the chat box. So please get those in. So Jeremy, you mentioned earlier on looking for projects that also had other benefits so that they'd have a revenue stream, and thus kind of avoiding the problem of resilience not being there not being compensation directly usually for resilience itself. And then you mentioned different resilience concerns, whether a site needs straight up just supply, or you offered the example of under-frequency load shedding. One of the things we see a lot with storage projects, we talk about all the amazing things that energy storage can do, all these different services, But if there's not a value stream for something, even if it's just a matter of how it's set up in the software or like the manual for the operators, you're not going to provide something like frequency support if there's no value stream there for that. So do you have any thoughts? You mentioned you actually posed this question a little bit near the end. Any thoughts how a project would be able to ensure that it had the capabilities for the specific locational resilience needs with a revenue stream or otherwise?
Yeah, so, and I see a question in the chat box that I think is similar. Trying to think of the best way to answer that. So a couple of things. If you are, it's really going to depend. If you're dealing with a project in an organized market area, there may already be price signals. There might be market products for you to tap into. They may already have spinning reserve markets. They may already have frequency response markets. So looking at if it's a little more transparent, a little more obvious if you're in an organized market. What we're starting to see outside of organized markets is there's some kind of grid expert involved in the transaction. Either the site in question is dealing directly with the utility, and the utility is controlling the device and dispatching the device as needed, or there's an aggregator that's doing that. Yeah, that's kind of the simplified way to do it, because outside of organized markets, you don't have that transparent pricing around what is a grid service worth. But if you can partner with a utility or an aggregator that does have that transparency, and allow them to be able to dispatch the device on your behalf, that's something that we're seeing as kind of a common theme across all these projects that we've been looking at, is that the utility or some trusted partner has their finger on the switch.
Great, thanks. Have you seen anywhere that's looked at like utilities, regulated utilities, they're looking to rate base this kind of thing for resilience specifically? Has that happened yet?
Not that I'm aware of, and that gets back to the fact, that issue up front is that there aren't standards for resilience. Regulators are, before joining the lab, I worked for 5 years as a regulator, and regulators are bound by what is tangible, what is fixed, and they can regulate for reliability because there's a standard that the utility has to meet, and the utility can clearly demonstrate I'm in compliance or I'm not in compliance, and so therefore I need to build X. We don't have that with resilience. A utility or a project developer can't come to a utility commission and say, hey, I want to rate base this based on providing resilience, because the regulator has no way of valuing or engaging that service. Resilience, sometimes I joke that, resilience is the new indecency. No one can define it, but they know it when they see it. And, absent some kind of policy, standards, metrics around resilience, it needs to be designed to play in a reliability world. It needs to be designed to generate revenue and pencil out based on reliability standards.
Great, thanks. Reminder, folks can submit their questions in the chat box. Got a little time left, so please go ahead and do that. What's next for your research in these areas at PNNL once you're the other side of this DOE report? What's on the horizon for resilience and batteries with you guys?
Well, I think we're really interested in this idea of, as Samantha's question got to, how do you inform tariff design? How do you design a tariff that will incent this kind of behavior, that will encourage ratepayers, third parties to make these kinds of investments? Hawaii has actually emerged as a leader in this area. Their legislature last year actually required their utility commission to develop a microgrid services tariff. And again, in Hawaii, you don't have an organized market, so you're essentially asking the regulator to put dollars and cents on services that haven't traditionally had transparent dollars and cents attached to them. So it's a very interesting development. It's a very challenging undertaking. And so we're watching that closely, and we're thinking about, what are the research needs to help inform those kinds of proceedings, because I imagine Hawaii will not be the last to go down that road.
I mean, Hawaii, in a lot of ways, in a lot of these issues, is moving a lot faster for various reasons. Have you seen other states showing interest in your work with Hawaii?
Well, this is all still pretty new, and the interesting thing about Hawaii that I hadn't thought about before all this is, they worry about resilience or they have to worry about resilience. They have to worry about reliability. In the mainland U.S., if I lose a generating asset, if I lose a transmission asset, I can lean on my neighboring balancing authorities. I can lean on my neighboring utilities to help me ride through that. Hawaii doesn't have that option. Every utility is literally and electrically an island. And so they have to think about resilience and reliability in a much more tangible and immediate way than anyone else does. But it's important to note it's not just Hawaii. As I mentioned, New York's REV proceeding, that has become a lot of different things. But if you go back to the founding documents of REV, it was a response to Hurricane Sandy. Hurricane Sandy devastated the region, and the original idea behind REV was, how do we make our electric system more resilient and distributed and capable of withstanding something like that? So, this is happening in a lot of places.
Yeah, definitely. We did a webinar back in January, which I can make a pitch for members can go back and find that on the website, and highlighting that, a Port of Honolulu is sort of positioned ideally to get hit by a great big hurricane at some point, and that would be where you'd need to be getting all your mutual aid crews coming in through the Port of Honolulu mostly, and so if the generator for the port's out, how do you get everyone in to fix the generator for the port? And that'll be the catch-22 there. Next question we have here from Robin Heidowitz. Do you envision payments for resilience in organized markets or from utilities, parentheses, not in organized markets? What could that look like?
Not in the near term. In order for there to be payments, there would have to be a standard behind that. There would have to be something, a standard that the utility has to meet and is therefore willing to pay for this service. Absent that kind of standard, I don't see direct compensation for resilience in the near future. We're still trying to figure out, what do we mean by resilience? So I think that, and that's really why we're trying to go down this road is, instead of waiting for some kind of policy development, some kind of standard development around resilience, how can we start to pursue objectives within the framework that we have?
Right, thanks. Just say Samantha Ruiz writes in and is keen to follow up more about tariff design. Jeremy's email, of course, is on the screen, and ESA is also happy to make any introductions, can link you up with Jeremy. Any other means? I don't have any further questions in the chat box, so I will talk a little bit slowly here if you're trying to bash out one last question as I draw towards wrapping up. Let's see. Not too late to ask a question as I move forward here. Before we finish, I'd like to highlight once more ESA's annual conference in Phoenix, April 16th to 18th. It occurred to me during this webinar that folks would also find a session we've got on valuing storage as a transmission and distribution resource particularly interesting and relevant. Where generation's not the problem for resilience, where it's a matter of particularly impacts on the distribution network. How we are looking at energy storage in our short, medium, long-term T&D planning, an important part of the equation for energy storage, important part for resilience, security, so many other important issues. And with that, I will thank Jeremy once again for joining us on this webinar. Very insightful, very interesting. We'll definitely get, when we see that DOE report come up, we'll definitely put that up on energystoragenews.org. Energystoragenews.org is our sort of weekly news roundup of interesting articles and energy storage topics. So we'll definitely make sure that makes its way up there. You can watch for it there, or of course on the PNNL website. Thanks to everyone for joining us today. If you have any questions regarding upcoming events or webinars or ideas regarding topics that you'd like to see us cover later in the year, please email them to us at education@energystorage.org. Again, we really value your feedback. We also, of course, will have a ReadyTalk feedback box pop up at the conclusion of this webinar. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks to all our participants. And
Thank you.
I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Goodbye.